You're listening to the Luminate series on the Forward Faster podcast, providing bite-sized insights for entrepreneurs in the optics, photonics, and imaging sector.
The biggest concern in the autonomous vehicle market is safety, and night vision is one of the biggest concerns with safety. Hello, welcome to the Forward Faster podcast. My name is Damon Deal, and I'm the Technology Program Manager for the Luminate Startup Accelerator. We are the largest accelerator for optics, photonics, and imaging startups in the world. And today, I have one of the members of our cohort. His name is Chuck Gershman, and he is the CEO and co-founder of Owl AI. To start off with, what I always ask people is, can you tell me a little bit about the problem that Owl AI is solving and why that is important?
So generally, a couple of years ago, myself and my co-founder, Gene Patilli, looked at the sensing market, specifically because we have a lot of background and experience in sensors. And we identified that sensors are becoming a predominant upgrade and predominant standard feature within the automotive space. And the reason for that is to drive down accidents and improve safety. And so cameras and radar, traditional cameras and radar, have been used in cars now for quite some time. And the take-up rate in terms of the number of radar elements and the number of camera elements has been increasing dramatically, all around something called ADAS, which is automated driver assist for safety. And the insurance institutes have been measuring this and have seen dramatic improvements in the reduction in accidents and the amount of lives that have been saved because of these sensor features. But the industry is still really only scratching the surface in terms of what they could actually do. And there will be, over the coming decades, or at least over the next decade, a vast improvement in what can be done from a safety perspective. And that implies potentially, and we're pretty confident it does imply that, extending the sensor suite beyond just radar and traditional visual cameras. And that's kind of where we come in.
As the autonomous vehicle market is moving on, what are the trends that you're leveraging to get your business off the ground? You mentioned a little bit about the insurance industry. Is there anything else that's pushing, that's helping you at this time get yourself launched forward?
Well, I think we should take a step back because autonomy, the term autonomous vehicle is very sexy, and we see it in the trade press and we see it in the mainstream media. But that's a subset of what's actually going on in the marketplace. So we look at the safety as a continuum. So today you can buy production vehicles. You can go down to your favorite automobile manufacturer and go onto the showroom floor, and you'll get safety features that are built right into the vehicle today. Again, under the moniker of ADAS features. And there's a continuum. As they continue to add those features, the safety will get better and better. At a certain point, you can theoretically hit a tipping point where the safety is so good that the car can be autonomous. Now, some companies are chasing autonomy right out of the gate. We see that with robo taxis and robo trucking, but that's kind of taking the safety continuum all the way towards the latter part, all the way to its conclusion or close to its conclusion. But today, you could just incrementally improve safety using the same technology that would ultimately be used that's ultimately used in the autonomy vehicle. So it's all one continuum. It's just where you are on the continuum. So so our products are viable to today's production vehicles, and they're viable for today's, for the forthcoming or the robo-taxi or robo-trucking market. But today's vehicles can take advantage of our technology.
Yeah, that's a great point, that the work that you're doing is actually already immediately commercializable. But one of the really interesting things that you're doing is this trend toward these really powerful self-learning artificial intelligences. And that's something that you guys have definitely been able to take advantage of. Is there anything you want to say about that?
So what we're discussing is the concept of perception. So to make a vehicle safer, whether that's an on-road vehicle or even an off-road vehicle, like a tractor or a dump truck, we need to be able to perceive the environment, similar in the ways that humans perceive the environment. So we need to not only quote unquote see things, we also have to be able to identify them and classify them as to what they are. And we also need to be able to estimate where they are. And we also need to be able to estimate where they're going. So we need to understand a trajectory. Now, we humans actually do this pretty well with just our eyes, with two eyes and our brains, and a lot of practice. But these perception systems need to be able to emulate that. And the best way to emulate that is to create images and be able to project those images into a computer in a three-dimensional space. So I'm not talking about virtual reality. I'm talking about the ability to perceive the environment so that we can see it, we can identify it, we can classify it, we can detect it, and we can determine where it is and where it's going. And that's what these sensor systems are designed to do. So we use artificial intelligence to support that. And we use artificial intelligence to help us do object identification. And we can train computer systems to recognize images. And we've seen that in the 2D space all the time. We now have computers that can tell you that there's a cat and a dog. But we can do that to tell the difference between, a person or a mailbox or a fire hydrant or a light post. And that can be doable with artificial intelligence. We can also use artificial intelligence to do a few other things. We can use it for gesture recognition, and we can use it for ranging. And that's where we really leverage it. So our night vision, which are made from thermal cameras, natively produce a 2D video, two-dimensional video, like what you would see on a traditional movie or what you would see on TV. But how do we take a 2D video and produce depth? So how do we measure where these objects are in 3D space? And we use artificial intelligence to take 2D images and produce depth perception quite accurately. So not only do we identify the object, but we measure where it is, and we also are able to then, once we have that depth, with frame to frame, we can calculate projected trajectory, and that's necessary for perception systems for safety.
Yeah, the way you described to me before, and I really loved it, is I guess somebody had asked you, how are you getting 3D imagery with one camera? And you said, well, how do you do it? Because people are able to use one eye and tell how far something is away. We've developed that in our brains, and you've taught a camera how to do that. Yeah.
Right. So actually, the people example is okay, but we have two eyes, so our brains take advantage of our two eyes to create triangulation. But not all animals have two forward-facing eyes, but they still measure depth. So if you go to the farm and you see the chickens walking around, you'll notice that they have two eyes, but they're on the sides of their head. They're not forward-facing; they're sideward. They're sideways facing. But the chickens always bob. So why are chickens bobbing? Because the motion that the chicken creates from the bobbing allows them to measure depth. So they still get depth perception, but they use a combination of a single eye and some known motion that then their brains are able to calculate the depth. So you can get depth from a single camera.
Yeah, I think it's amazing. It's fascinating what you guys are doing. To steer things a little bit into away from the technical and into you as an entrepreneur, you have a lot of experience. And again, we're not going to do any math there, but
thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah, but I ask people a lot usually is, hey, you've started a business. What have you learned that you weren't expecting? You've done this many times. So what are things that people, when they're starting as an entrepreneur, probably don't appreciate and are things that you can help them avoid as far as mistakes or oversight?
Wow, that's a laundry list there. if you're starting an enterprise, I mean, one, you have to capture the imagination of a customer base, and you have to solve a problem, and that problem has to be compelling enough that the customer base would be willing to take a risk on a new entity as opposed to your established players. So the status quo is always the de facto, and you're basically upsetting the status quo. So that's number one, and that's one constituency. Then another constituency is, can you attract employees, and can you make it exciting, and can you create a vision such that people want to be associated with you? And I call that, I kind of leverage the shared belief system. And so what do you believe, and do others in your constituency, do they believe the same thing? If so, they will follow, or they may follow, right? They may become excited by it. And then, but those two things are really hard, but they're still the low-hanging fruit. Because the harder part is, how do you get investors to actually share your vision, share your belief system, and invest in you? And that actually, unfortunately, gets a little more analytical, because investors, even if you can get them emotionally excited about what you're doing, that doesn't necessarily separate them from their money.
Yes, exactly. They do this for a living, right?
They do it for a living. So they've worked out some models in order to ensure that they don't just give you money based on emotions. So, and those models are based on risk profiles, and then in comparative risk profiles. So even though your customers are super excited, even though your employees can't wait to come to work in the morning, and even though you're demonstrating great success, that still might not get you below the risk profile for an investor, especially an institutional investor. And that's probably the hardest thing to come to grips with. So after, more than a decade and a half of doing this, almost 2 decades of doing it, it's still surprising to me how incredulous an investor will be when all the other constituents are just totally fired up about where you are, what you've done, and where you're going. And still separating investors from their money is really, really hard.
So based on that, do you have thoughts on what people can do to de-risk themselves as an investment?
Well, the first thing you need to do is check your entrepreneurship at the door, and pretend you are an investor, and at least try to learn as much as you can to appreciate where they're coming from, or at least their model and their thought process, such that the arguments that you're making for investment drive directly to their problems, to the way they analyze the situation, not necessarily the way you see it per se. And that is also difficult, because I like to say that, if you ask 3 investors for their opinion, you'll probably get 6 different answers. So it's not a cookie cutter problem to solve, and every investor has a different thesis. So investment portfolios have thesis, which is an investment criteria. And pitching an investor whose thesis doesn't align with your company is never going to be successful. So at a minimum, you've got to match the thesis. Then the investor is going to evaluate you on 3 things. They do simplify it down to 3 things. They evaluate you based on market. So they're not going to invest in a company that's in a market that they don't want to invest in, or a market that they don't think can produce hyper growth. So you have to show them a market with hyper growth potential. They're going to invest in you based on your technology. So do you attack that market with a differentiated, unique value proposition, right? So the problem that you're addressing, is there something about it that's significantly defensible, such that it gives you some kind of unique advantage? And then the third thing is the team and the people. And those 3 things have to be brought together, and every one of them has to be maximized, and every one of them has to be scrutinized. A long time ago, I was at a E&Y sponsored event where there were a series of venture capitalists that were on the panel. And there's a gentleman that was on the panel. His name is Erwin Fetterman. He's from US Venture Partners. And Erwin, I think even at that time, was a 35 or 40-year veteran of venture capital. He's one of the original venture capitalists. And they asked this question similar to what you asked. And Erwin said, of the three things that we invest in, that we look at, market, technology, and people, people's always number one. Because I've been in the business long enough to tell you that not a single business plan that I've ever invested in paid off based on the business plan I invested in. There was always a pivot along the way. And the pivot is a direct reflection of the management team and the founders.
I actually deleted a question that I used to ask all the time about what was most important, because all anybody ever says is the team, and you just can't say it enough, that without the right team, it doesn't matter what the idea is.
And the ability for that team to check their bias at the door. You have to be willing to accept that you don't know all the answers day one, and that your idea will get massaged by the market. My other kind of rule of thumb is, why do startups even exist, and why are they even successful? And a lot of people point to the to the 1 in a million case where the idea is so unique, and of course, right? But that it doesn't make up the majority of startups. The majority of startups have identified something that's disruptive, but it's not a revolution, it's an evolution, right? So what is it about a startup where they create a an order of magnitude evolution, and they're successful, when the incumbent player in the market has more money, more people, more PhDs, more resources? In fact, if you go down the list of everything a company has, they have more of than you have, and you're never going to match it line item for line item. You're never going to be close. So why is it that you can still be successful competing against a billion-dollar corporation or a multi-billion-dollar corporation? And it's a simple answer: time to decision. In a startup, I can create a hypothesis or a thesis. I can test it. I can even possibly prototype it, and I can evaluate it, and I can determine whether it's right. And if it needs to be modified, if it needs to be pivoted, if it needs to be enhanced, I can quickly make that decision and go do it. And I argue that I can get something wrong 3 times in the time it takes a multi-billion-dollar corporation to decide to even try it once. And that's the power of a startup.
There are no committee meetings, right? When you have an all-hands meeting, you can all stand around a pizza and have a pretty good conversation.
A pizza, a whiteboard, and some markers, and decide that what you're doing is right on the money, or it's just a little off course, and what can we do to modify it? And you don't have to take it up through a series of management chains and sign off and budget reviews and oh, I spent some money that I shouldn't have spent there, but I need to spend some more over here. You just make the decision and go.
And the courage, I like the courage to have an eraser with your whiteboard, right? You keep talking about, yeah.
Again, pride and ego, check them at the door, because you're not hitting the target at the bullseye every time. You might get lucky and get it once or twice, but there's going to be some things that are on the outside of the target. You got to pull them back in. It's going to happen.
One thing that I like to ask people, it comes a little bit out of the blue, but what did you want to be when you grew up? What is it that, or maybe even when did you know you wanted to become an entrepreneur?
So I grew up in a resort community, in a summer resort community, where everything was focused on the tourist. It was a nice little beach town, and everybody made their money. Everybody owned a shop or a store, and the tourists would come in June and they would leave in September, and then you'd go from 750,000 people on an island in the summer to 10,000 people in the wintertime. And the total town was bought into this whole mentality of the tourist, every September they would complain about the tourist season. And with all due respect, and it'll sound a little pompous, it seems so small-minded to me. It was just right. I was like, there's more in the world than this, right? There's more than just waiting for the tourists to come in June. Now, maybe when you get to 60 or 50 or 60, you might want to go back to waiting for the tourists to come in June. But when I was young, I was like, there's got to be more to the world, and I couldn't wait to escape, go to college, get an education, and get out and see, a broader picture of what was going on. So I escaped to college and got an engineering, an engineering degree, and eventually discovered that I had a talent. So more than a skill set, more than knowledge or intellectual knowledge, I had a skill set. And my skill set, a talent. My talent was that I had learned how to inherently kind of knew how to take really, really complex ideas from really, really smart people. And if I spent a couple of weeks with them in a Q&A and really understood deep dive what they were doing, I could raise the level of the messaging such that I could keep taking it up to levels to almost to the point where a layperson could feel comfortable with what this technologist was doing. And that just came kind of natural to me. So once I discovered this talent, I recognized that, I could partner with these really, really smart people and help them realize their ideas in the real world. And that's how I became an entrepreneur.
That ties right back into what you were saying about matching a thesis, right? The ability to take a concept and make it into something that an investor is going to see matches with what they want to do. Yeah, that's fantastic. The thing I like to close with is, in 10 words or less, what is an inspiring action that entrepreneurs can take?
I'm going to go with affirmation. All right. So I went back and said that team is number one, right? That's ultimately number one. And number two, I said that it's about vision and belief and having people, having a team that all has a shared belief system, and you set the visions and you show them where they're going, and they'll want to go there with you, right? But affirmation, you have to keep individual team members inspired that they're doing the right thing. And when they do good, you need to tell them they did good. And you need to tell them they did good as often as possible as you can. So people really, really need affirmation. It's kind of core to who we are. And it means the world to them, and then they're going to work harder, and they're going to go harder, and they're going to feel part of the team.
So keep your team inspired. If I'm gonna cut you down to 10 words, keep
your team inspired.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Okay, Chuck, thank you so much for being here, and it is a pleasure to see you. I look forward to being able to see you in person again sometime soon. To all of our viewers, thank you for joining us. And if you enjoy the program, please like and subscribe, as these YouTube people, the kids these days, always say. And we look forward to seeing you at the next Core Forward Faster podcast. Thank you very much.